Thank you, everyone. As I just said, we're gonna briefly talk about how we use the Datawrapper API for everything from quick prototypes to charts that play basically all the bells and whistles. I am Finn. I freelance with Süddeutsche. This is Sören.
Yes, hi, and sorry for our names, which are really hard to pronounce, especially mine and Deutsche Zeitung as well. But well, not the way how names work here in Germany or in Scandinavia, where my first name is from. But let's move to the talk. Thank you for having us. And we want to show you four key things you might take away from our talk. First thing is that you should forget about copy and paste and use the Datawrapper API whenever it's possible. The second one is how Datawrapper fits in our automated pipelines and that you should use that too if you can. The third one is that it's even possible to use Datawrapper to fake interactive dashboards. And the last point we want to make is if you don't have time for custom chart front end, then just use a lot of Datawrappers. And we want to do a little shout out to Benedikt Witzenberger, who worked with us some years ago at Deutsche Zeitung and created this Datawrapper package, which we built our work heavily on. And it's very helpful, but don't be afraid. All these examples we show here are in R, but are of course transferable to other coding languages you might use.
All right. And on to our first point. The almost heretical point that you should forget Datawrapper's core main selling point to just copy paste data into Datawrapper and you have a chart in a couple of minutes. We say sometimes forget about copy and paste, use the Datawrapper API to create your charts. Why would you do that? What we often do is we create a chart in the user interface, copy the ID from our URL, paste into our development environment, our tidyverse pipe, directly in our analysis, and then design our chart in Datawrapper. Basically refresh the browser window and go pick a scatter plot, change the size to the variable. Then we have our first prototype and can go on either doing other charts or why we do this in the first place, the profit in what comes afterwards. You can continue using the pipe in your notebooks, which gives you a synchronization between analysis and charts for free, which gives you reproducibility. Or even for automated data updates, you can expand your pipe or the script around it to also update the metadata, for example. And Sören will talk more about our metadata in our automated pipelines.
Yes, thank you. I think this is really great to have reproducible code because I sometimes forget where my data is coming from. I did maybe a year ago or 2 years ago. And to build on the work I did previously, I like to have it somewhere in my code. And that is something we also use to do a lot of automatic pipelines because we have tons of charts which we update on a daily basis. During the COVID pandemic, we even did updates several times a day. And that's all possible using the Datawrapper API. One thing, or the first thing I want to show is the most simple one, that we can just upload new data to our charts using the API, like Finn already showed us. And what we then always place in our chart is some kind of date, because we want to know when the chart was last updated. Our readers should know that. and that's something we put in there. And you can also use the API to change, for example, the color or the width of lines if that's necessary. Some more advanced things are, for example, text annotations, which we use and even move where we need these text annotations. One example here is the Republican delegates for the primaries now. How many delegates are already elected? How many are missing? This is what the chart here shows. And we want to lead our readers' eyes to that point we want to make there, which is that 1,354 delegates are now elected. And on the left side, you can see the Datawrapper front end where you can put in your text, put in the exact position where you want to have that label, and all that you can also find in the metadata file. And that file you can adjust using the API. Here is some of that metadata in our studio, where you can find this X field, the Y field, so all the coordinates. You can find the text and you can adjust all that. And that's something we show on the next slide. There we just use that part where we have the text annotation, the X and Y axis, and where to put that label, and we just exchange it every time we publish the chart and push new data there, and then can just easily create a chart with great annotations. And to show you some more examples why we need that is especially to lead our readers' eyes on if we publish charts on a daily basis, we mostly want to highlight the current status of the data. That's something we can greatly do with these text annotations, which we push via the API. One last thing, which is also possible and which we used during the COVID pandemic, were these trend arrows, where we wanted to highlight in which direction the pandemic is leading. And that is something we once figured out how this SVG code has to look like to create these errors. And then we could put them in here, parse the markdown button in the Datawrapper field, and then we could use these errors even for our print version. And that was very helpful. And now I'll talk how we can use all that to even build interactive dashboards with Datawrapper. Some of the speakers before us already talked about HTML buttons, which can be introduced into charts to build some fake interactivity, or interactivity, but to fake loading new charts. And we can also use that and adapt that using the API. The example here is a map of the risk of infection depending on group size and vaccination status for all counties in Germany. This was close to Christmas time, and we wanted to show how risky it is to meet smaller or bigger parts or groups of people depending on their vaccination status. And there are just four quite simple steps to create such interactive dashboard with Datawrapper. The first is just create a chart, as we already showed in Datawrapper, customize it as you need it. And the second step is that you can build in these fake hyperlinks that's shown on the next slide. We used a lot of code provided in this Datawrapper Academy blog post and just adjusted it to our need, adjusted some colors to highlight which button is selected at the moment and which chart the link should lead to. And we built this first with some fake hyperlinks, and then we copied the chart. This is third step repeated that, and it's definitely better to do that using the API, because then you can easily store the ideas and what it should show directly in your code in a data frame. And the fourth step is then to insert the correct data and exchange the hyperlinks, because you can find this intro field where all these HTML buttons are written into, and write in there whatever you need and exchange easily the IDs, other colors, and so on for every chart. And if you need to change something, it's quite easy to do it in your code, and you don't have to get manually into every chart and change that.
All right, thank you, Sören. And the last and slightly absurd point is, if you don't have time to program chart yourself, you might just get away with just creating lots of data wrappers. Our challenge was in our election reporting, we had one article per election district. And we wanted to show a scatter plot showing all results in all districts, but highlighting the current district, so the district that was written about in the page the data wrapper chart was embedded in. We did not have resources for a custom programmed solution, because our resources that could have programmed it were busy programming the 300 articles and the infrastructure for that. So what did we do? We created a data wrapper prototype and scaled it up. We had one prototype and copied 300 times with the same settings and style, but different annotations in each chart. We had a custom view on the data for every chart. What you can see here, for example, is the results of the Conservative Party in comparison. So we have the amount of votes on the x-axis and the wins and losses on the y-axis. We really like this view on election results, but it gets a bit overwhelming, so we want the annotations. And you can see here the chart versions for Munich East, Munich North, and Ingolstadt, and you can see very different positions for the Conservative Party in the same cloud. And of course, we don't only have to do this for 300 or 300 districts, but also for each party. So here you can see the same repeated for the SPD, for the Social Democrats, for the AfD. Germany's more right-wing party, and not shown even more parties. And then, of course, we created a chart showing all parties. And here again, you can see annotation for, on the left bottom, Munich East, one for each party in Munich East. On the top, we have Ingolstadt again. And on the bottom right, we have Munich North. And that's, of course, not the end. We also had to connect those charts with buttons so that our users could decide what party they might want to focus on. Since it's such a complicated chart, we did want to provide different views on the data. All right. So that's already the chart with all the bells and whistles. What did we need for that? We needed an overview, of course. We had to create all the charts and had an overview of all chart IDs and what content is supposed to be in them. We had to have labels, text labels, and annotations depending on the select districts, which Sören has shown before how you can do that. We had to align the limits of each chart, so the transitions between the charts kind of worked out. We were lucky that we basically chose limits that before the election that worked during the election night, but we could have fixed that using the Datawrapper API as well. We faked the dashboard using the HTML buttons. As Sander noted, that there are Python examples from his previous talk as well. And we actually published the first versions of our election night article without the scatter plots, and only slowly filled up our 2,100 charts, then added them to the articles because we wanted to be nice to the server, especially because we didn't want the Datawrapper team that we would do this. Not that we had any reason to doubt the service because everything went smoothly, but no one wants that additional risk on election night. All right, would we do this again? It's complicated. Our most current version is a custom graphic created by our visual desk. In the next election, we did have some resources, and we could have a custom graphic that was just passed the district ID and which parties to show. We had those over 2,000 Datawrapper charts as a workaround for a lack of development capacity. But of course, we'd do it again. It's not the first choice, but if it was the choice between no chart because of no capacity or this hack, we would take the hack any day.
Thank you, Finn. So just to wrap up, let's repeat the key takeaways you should take away from our talk. First, don't use copy and paste too much. Use the Datawrapper API if it's possible. Use the Datawrapper API to automate pipelines because this can help a lot to report on current topics. Use Datawrapper to fake interactive dashboards if that's necessary. It's very helpful. On the last part, don't hesitate to build lots of Datawrappers. That's especially possible with the Datawrapper API. So if you don't have time for custom chart front ends, then use this solution. And that's it from us. Thank you for having us. If you want to reach out, you find our contact here. You can write me an email or visit Finn's website. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you both for such a wonderful speech. It was great to get a peek into the process on your side and see what features are helpful, what kind of hacks you use. Very interesting, especially the making a dashboard. And I do have one question of my own. I have a couple of questions of my own, but I want to lead with one at least. The idea of putting up a dashboard for those vaccination rates in kind of counties in Germany, that map looked very intricate. And you mentioned it went up right around Christmas, which I think was not that long after vaccinations started. How long did it take for that process to go up in terms of start to finish, if you remember?
The time we needed to build that chart, I think it wasn't that much time because we already used those buttons before. And we built heavily on the Datawrapper Academy blog posts, and that helped a lot. So we just had the idea that we want to show the risk of meeting different groups of people, because it depends a lot how many people you meet, how big the risk of infection was. And at that time, we had some rules in Germany, how many people you might even be allowed to meet at the time. So I think it was just from the initial idea to the end of that story, it was maybe 2 weeks, but to build that chart, it was a day, maybe, I'd say.
I mean, incredible.
And I think, to be clear, it was about a year after the first vaccinations in Germany. So the vaccination rates were relevant at the time. But yeah, it was not like we have the first vaccination in 2 days. We need to already need a data story on that.
Yeah, makes more sense. I got my dates wrong. Corona, I like to block it out. But I also did want to ask, Sören, you mentioned at the top that you use this pipeline method to maintain and keep track of data that spans back years. Are there any specific projects that have been that long running that you'd like to mention beyond the usual Corona projects?
Well, in my work, it's most of the time it's climate related data, because this comes up again and again, and sometimes I want to build on some reporting we already did a year ago or 2 years ago. And well, there are a lot of data sources out there, and to remember where my original data is from is quite hard. So I try to always write that into my code, and then use that information, if it's possible, even to download the data in the code, then push it to the chart, and work that way. So it's greatly reproducible. And that's what I try to do. Not always that I do that, and I think that's quite bad that I don't, but I try to do it.
I think
It's definitely a best practice from the sound of it. Oh, sorry.
all good. I think the other long-running dashboard-like article is a natural gas status of natural gas in Germany, which also was where many of the screenshots of our examples came from.
Perfect. Yeah, both very relevant topic. Well, fantastic. I think we're right about time. Thank you both once again. It was a wonderful talk.